Dr. Jordan Peterson's rapid rise to fame was based around his best-selling book, 12 Rules for Life. But as his public profile grew, many began to view him in a political light. Is that the result of the unique political climate we're seeing under President Trump? Here is Dr. Peterson. We were talking about this earlier, but before we came on air, that you never really thought of yourself as a political author and public figure. But that is how, and as I've been saying, you know, as we've seen, so much of your message is the personal. It's how you, as an individual, can behave and take responsibility. But yet you are being painted in a political light. Do you see yourself as a political figure?
Not particularly, no, but everyone that I'm interviewed by virtually insists that that's what I am.
Right.
But the reason for that is that most of our dialogue in the mainstream media, I would say, is always focused on political issues. And so if you have a hammer, then everything looks like a nail.
Right.
But it's also the case that part of what brought me to wider public attention was my opposition to some legislation in Canada, a bill called C-16, which I regarded as an attempt on the government's part to compel speech, which, by the way, in the United States, the Supreme Court in the United States in the 1940s decided that it was unconstitutional for the government to ever require you to say certain things.
Right.
There's exceptions for commercial speech. So if you sell tobacco products, for example, you might have to put a label on your packaging. But in private speech, there's to be no compulsion from the government. It's different than forbidding you to say certain things, because this was a requirement for a certain form of speech. And that emerged in this bill, C-16, which purported to do nothing but extend certain rights to the transgender community in Canada, but which was, in my estimation, and I read the policies very carefully, an attempt to write a particular view of gender into the law, the view that gender is only a consequence of environmental conditions, is socially constructed, which is patently false and runs contrary to what I would regard as thoroughly settled science, and also to compel a certain form of address. And I felt that that meant that the politicians in Canada were using a false compassion and a certain ideological attitude to justify extending dominion over the content of free people's speech. And for me, that in combination with the doctrine, the gender social construction doctrine, that was a no-go. I'm not in alignment with either of those. They're wrong. Right. And so I made some videos saying that very clearly, and that pulled me into a political controversy.
And so that resulted in you being described as, or associated with, broadly speaking, the right. Would you put yourself on the right politically, or is that a term you don't even necessarily accept?
Well, one of the things that's happened to me as a consequence of being a social scientist is that I've become more respectful of caution and tradition. And the reason for that is that, and this really is a consequence of being trained properly as a social scientist, what you learn if you're a social scientist who's educated and who's experienced is that things are a lot more complicated than you think they are. And your intervention to make things better probably didn't specify the problem properly and is very unlikely to produce the consequences that you intended. And so the careful social scientists, they have a doctrine which is taught to everyone who's going to be properly trained, which is if you dare to intervene in someone's life or more broadly in public policy, you make the intervention minimal, you control it very carefully, and then you analyze the outcome to see if your intervention worked. Because most of the time, not only will it not work, it will be counterproductive in ways you didn't predict.
That's so different from, I mean, I used to work in government. That is so different from the attitude that is typically there. We've got time for a question. Michael.
Yes. Dr. Peterson, it's a pleasure to see you today.
Thank you.
Dr. Peterson, reading you and hearing you on YouTube, what have you, it seems to be you clearly have an issue with ideologues on both the extreme left and the extreme right. What I call the twin cobras, or the matter and antimatter of our political discourse. So you wrote in your book that our minds are deeply social. And so with that question as a social scientist, are we nurtured to the views that we have grown to have, or are we somehow hardwired by nature to some degree to have a tendency toward one way of thinking or the other? And if we are, if you started to agree with that,
Yeah.
if we are predisposed to have some sort of leaning one way or the other, then are we not doomed to a sense of zero-sum warfare for political power? Winners and losers like your friendly lobsters?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is we are tilted by our biological temperament in terms of our political viewpoint. So we know, for example, that conservative people tend to be higher in conscientiousness, a big 5 personality trait, especially in the orderliness element of that trait. And they tend to be lower in another trait, openness. And openness is, broadly speaking, the creativity trait. And so, whereas liberals are high in openness but low in orderliness. And there is very powerful biological tilting towards those temperamental predispositions. Now, they can be moved by experience, but it's as if you have a set point and then you have to strive to move from that set point. Okay, so, and then of course, your viewpoints can be modified by your experience and your wisdom, all of that. But you have to start out with a set of filters on the world because the world is too complicated. And so you have to, your mind, your brain, your psyche filters things for you and then presents a certain world to you. So because you can't read all the facts, and some facts jump out at you and others don't, and that's partly a consequence of your temperament. Okay, so that's not necessarily a bad thing because there are different niches for people of different temperaments. So, for example, introverts are good at such things as accounting. They're more because they can work alone, whereas extroverts are better at things like sales. And so there's a place for people on both ends of the temperamental distribution. And with creative people, you might think, well, creativity is a good thing. Why isn't everyone creative? It's like, well, most creative ideas are dangerous, and it's very difficult to monetize creativity. Sometimes if you do it successfully, you're wildly successful, but more often you'll fail. So you need people who are wild experimenters in thinking and those who are more conservative. Now then, your next question was, well, doesn't that doom us to counterproductive opposition? And the first issue is, opposition is not necessarily counterproductive. Like if you want to hone the way you think, you need opposition. You need something pushing against you. But what has to happen, and this is rule 9, is you have to assume that the person that you're listening to, or that you're talking with, knows something you don't. And so we can engage in a dialogue between left and right. The right tends to stand for hierarchy and to value hierarchies as tools for obtaining necessary goals. And the left tends to view hierarchies as characterized by the proclivity to dispossess and to become tyrannical. Those are both correct. Through the dialogue, we can keep the hierarchies functional and also pay attention to the people who are at the bottom. That requires dialogue. It requires that opposition.
By the way, great question. I think that's such a great example of how, even though you may not think of yourself as a political participant, your participation in political conversation is really, really helpful. Thank you so much.